Israel's defense forces are expected to enter Gaza City within the next 48 hours, as officials say they have split the region in two as their ground assaults intensify. Now, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari has called it a significant stage in Israel's war against the Hamas terrorist group ruling the enclave. Well, joining us now live from Tel Aviv is columnist for Newsweek and historian Marc Schulman. Marc, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Is sadly exactly 1 month on from the initial Hamas attack. What's the general mood and feeling where you are at the moment in Tel Aviv?
I guess it's mixed. On one hand, it seems like only yesterday. On the other hand, it's like forever. You know, this has been going on forever. Some of us don't even remember what it was like before. The world changed on that day for most Israelis. And with that change is a sense that lives will not be the same. We don't know what the future holds, but it won't be the same as we expected before that day. And of course, not to mention all of the people who were directly impacted. I live in central Tel Aviv. Near me, within a block or two of my home, is the place where all of the hostage families demonstrate, where there's a table with 120 more than 120 settings at this point for the people who are hostage. A few blocks away is the Habima Theater. There are 200 or so empty beds that are set up representing the hostages. So that's on everyone's mind all of the time. And of course, today with 300,000 plus soldiers mobilized, almost nobody doesn't have either a son, a husband, a wife, a daughter who's now in the army. So for everybody, it's all consuming in some ways.
Marc, just talk us through the domestic political side of what is going on in Israel. I think it's fair to say Netanyahu doesn't have full support from the electorate. In fact, there were protests, I understand, just yesterday outside his home. What is the story there?
Yeah, I mean, there have been protests basically almost since the beginning of the war, small protests. The reality is a poll came out Friday that showed that only 28% of the people want him to remain prime minister. It's then divided between those who want him to resign now and those that want him to resign at the end of the war. A vast majority of Israelis, 60 to 70%, hold him personally responsible for what took place. And what took place from an Israeli perspective was the worst day in Israel's history since Israel was founded. So he's considered.
Marc? Sorry to interject. Why do people hold him personally responsible for October 7th?
Well, number one, he was the prime minister. So as President Truman of the United States said, the buck stops with me. The buck stops with him. He was the prime minister. Second of all, he formulated or pushed the plan that basically said we need to strengthen Hamas as a counterbalance to the Palestinian Authority. And he was the one who approved money that was going from Qatar. He also, every time there was some sort of an incident with Hamas, he insisted that we don't go all the way, that we don't do what we're doing now, that we just mow the lawn, so to speak, hurt them. And he would say, Hamas is deterred. Clearly, Hamas wasn't deterred. So he was the one responsible, ultimately. Yes, other people are responsible, the head of intelligence, the head of the army. You can go through a whole list of people who are also responsible. But ultimately, who was prime minister on that day? Who was prime minister is the person who's ultimately responsible.
And Marc, we've seen calls around the world. Certainly, it's been a big talking point here in the UK. Protests, calls for ceasefire, etc. Is there a similar feeling in Israel, in Tel Aviv? Are we starting to see now so many images coming out of Gaza of children being in huge numbers casualtied by this war? What is the feeling where you are about ending Israel's attack on Gaza?
Look, there's sadness about that. There's sadness when civilians get killed. There's no question there's sadness. But Israelis saw what happened 1 month ago today. They saw the images. Most of the most horrific images were not shared in Israel. They felt the Israeli population couldn't see some of the most horrific images. But considering that fact, most Israelis are saying, look, it's terrible what's happening in Gaza. We don't have any other way. We can't live with Hamas on our border in Gaza. And Hamas has to be eliminated as a government and a military force in Gaza. So, yes, it is terrible. But again, if we would have seen pictures during World War II from Dresden, from Berlin, from Tokyo, from all those places after Allied bombing, we'd all be horrified as well. But there was only one way to win World War II. And unfortunately, civilians pay a terrible price in war. It's terrible that war takes place.
Marc,
but there's no other choice that I know of.
Sorry to interrupt you. Isn't there an argument that we should have learnt those lessons from the Second World War?
Well, yes and no. And what was those lessons? We could have taken the Chamberlain view and not gone to war with the Nazis. So was that the answer? The answer was, in the end, it was a terrible, terrible cost. But look at it. Germany and Japan are both democratic, free countries as a result of the terrible things they went through and as a result of the sacrifice that the UK, the United States, and other allied nations took part in. So, yeah, it was a terrible thing. I have no question it was a terrible thing. And I think it's terrible that civilians get killed. It's absolutely terrible. But in the end, look at the end result. The only way, unfortunately, to win a war, there is no such thing as no collateral damage, I'm afraid. And it's very sad. It's very terrible. You know, I wish there was a laser we could use to just hit all the Hamas people, but it hasn't been invented yet. So again, it's terrible.
Mark, just to go back to the Netanyahu position, for those who want him out and replaced, is there a view then that a replacement to Netanyahu, which is probably not going to happen, but if there was, do Israelis want somebody to go in harder than Netanyahu is?
No, it's not. It's not the policy. It's not the policy. Right now, the policy is, people think the policy is appropriate. Netanyahu has a particular problem that because of his coalition, he's unable to come up with a plan for the day after, because his coalition is to the right of him. But the Israelis just want someone who is not responsible for what took place. There's also a sense that in the month that's taken since then, the army has recovered, but the government hasn't. And it's taken a long time for the government to put in economic plans, to put in social plans to deal with the situation. A lot of what took place in the 2 or 3 weeks after the beginning of the war was the same groups that were protesting Netanyahu and protesting the government said, okay, no one's doing this, we're going to do it. And they took care of providing for all the people who were moved out of Gaza and all of the soldiers who weren't getting what they were needed. Only slowly now, a month later, is the government beginning to function. And that's also seen as a problem in terms of Netanyahu.